That's right. Villages destroyed, thousands homeless. The east coast of the country is still recovering from the aftermath of Cyclone Amphan. What does this cyclone in Corona times really mean? What does it mean in the context of climate change in an ecologically sensitive area of the country? Today we are joined by a very special guest who's documented climate change and indeed the Bay of Bengal region extensively in his wonderfully written books. Amitav Ghosh, author, Sahitya Akademi Award winner, joins me from New York. Appreciate your joining us. Mr. Ghosh, thank you very much for joining us here from New York. I know you've written extensively on this, so you must feel particularly strongly when you see those images of villages being destroyed in and around the Sundarbans in particular. What do you think explains what happened in Bengal in this last week?
Well, Rajdeep, first of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I'm very glad to be here. Yes, it's been absolutely devastating to watch what's happening in the Sundarbans. Just to see how these places that I've spent so much time in have just been absolutely swamped. But again, it was completely predictable. In fact, on the day that the cyclone hit, I was asked by the Times of India, to do an interview, and I said, these are the things that are going to happen. Embankments are going to be swept away, freshwater sources are going to be swamped with seawater, the cultivable land is going to be salinated, so it won't be possible to cultivate anything on those lands for the next 2 or 3 years. So all of this was really perfectly predictable, really, but that doesn't in any way diminish the nature of the tragedy. It's horrifying to watch.
Do you believe it is linked to the larger question that you've been raising now for several years? The issue of change, is that something one should be really reflecting upon? Because it's not the first time, of course, that a cyclone has hit the region. This is a cyclone-prone region. We had Cyclone Fani last year, but the scale of destruction, the worst in Kolkata for almost 3 centuries. Has the sheer scale of what happened surprised you, and do you really link it to climate change?
To answer your first question first, yes, obviously there is a climate change connection with this. Many scientists have written about it. Kerry Emanuel from MIT, Michael Mann from Pennsylvania. It's clear that what's actually happening is that climate change is intensifying cyclones. So yes, we can expect more and more cyclones, of a greater intensity. So there's a very clear climate change fingerprint on cyclonic activity around the world. The Bay of Bengal, which has historically been known as a storm breeder, is going to have more storms. This is perfectly clear, and I've been saying so for a long time. That said, on the whole, I must say, it sounds sort of perverse to say this at this point, but this could have been much, much worse. It's kind of strange to think. I really thought it would be much worse than it has been. Mm-hmm. Because, in the first place, by the time the storm hit Kolkata, it had weakened greatly, so that it was really, the wind speeds were like 120, 130. Actually, in some parts of Calcutta, it was down to 110. But, and again, another stroke of incredible luck was that it hit at low tide. If it had hit at high tide, like Hurricane Sandy did in New York, it would have been, twice as bad, because Kolkata is a low-lying city. Much of it is below sea level. Kolkata would have been absolutely flooded. Yeah.
And I also read an interview of yours, Mr. Ghosh, where you said that, look, it's happened, Professor, on the East Coast this time, but it could well happen tomorrow even on the West Coast. That's equally vulnerable. I read somewhere where you said, God forbid if it happens in Mumbai tomorrow.
Well, I wrote about that in my book, The Great Derangement.
That's right.
One of the predicted consequences of climate change is that cyclonic activity will increase in the Arabian Sea. And, there was less cyclonic activity in the Arabian Sea for half the 19th century and most of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But that's a historical anomaly. between the mid 17th century and the mid 19th century, Mumbai has been directly hit by cyclones, by at least 5 major cyclones. So, and the possibility absolutely exists. As we speak now, there are 2 cyclones brewing at the same time in the Arabian Sea. And one of those may actually make landfall, on the West Coast. We don't know. There's a lot of uncertainty. I don't want to get anyone panicked. But, there is that possibility. So, on the East Coast, one of the great things that's happened over the last 20 years is that because the East Coast has historically been hit by a lot of cyclones, people have begun to prepare, and people have become very good at evacuation processes and so on. Especially Odisha, under Naveen Patnaik, he's become really a great sort of handler of these crises. So, there's a mechanism in place. On the West Coast, there isn't, because there's a historic complacency about cyclones. People think that cyclones will only hit the East Coast. And actually, in the case of Calcutta this time, I was astonished to find, I wrote to many people warning them about the cyclone, but many people paid no attention. Many people in Calcutta feel that, cyclone will hit Odisha or they'll hit Bangladesh. They just weren't prepared to be directly hit by a major cyclone. And it was very wrong to have that kind of complacency. So I would say to my friends in Mumbai, please think about these hazards. Don't panic, but think about these hazards and put in place, evacuation procedures and so on, because Mumbai is a city of over 20 million people. How are you going to evacuate Mumbai?
Do you think to that extent, Professor Ghosh, there isn't enough of a conversation even now on climate change in this country, that it requires a cyclone for us to suddenly start talking about it, that otherwise, as you said, the complacency that we have when it comes to dealing with these kind of phenomena, unless it hits us, we don't wake up to its reality?
Well, what can I say, Rajdeep? I mean, I've been shouting myself hoarse for years, trying to get people to pay attention to this. Look at the circumstances in India right now. I mean, the cyclone in Bengal, the locust attacks, the heat waves. I mean, India is just completely convulsed by climate change events, and still people don't pay attention. In 2016, when my book, The Great Derangement, came out, I happened to be in Delhi during a heat wave.
Yes.
And there was a major drought going on in Bundelkhand. Hundreds of thousands of people were leaving their ancestral lands and moving to cities and so on. Many of them are the migrants you see on the roads right now. And, Parliament only debated the drought once. Lok Sabha, it came up only once, and less than 1/10 of the members of Parliament were there. They were just not paying attention. They're not interested. Sadly, most of the representatives that we have across the country are urban people. They just don't understand or know what's going on in the countryside or even within the working class. Which is why, these pandemic lockdowns were sort of enforced in this incredibly draconian way, dislodging millions of migrant workers.
So in a sense, you're saying that, just as the lockdown in a way and the exodus of migrants has almost finally given a face to the invisible urban poor, you're suggesting that similarly, when a cyclone is hit, that's only when we start looking possibly at the consequences of climate change. It almost seems that these are invisible or invisibilized otherwise from the reality of day-to-day life.
See, Rajdeep, these crises are interconnected. They're not distinct, really. They're not caused by each other, but they're cognate. Mm-hmm. In Goa, where I have a house, for years now, I've noticed that more and more of the workers are Bengalis. In this small village in the countryside, there's one restaurant. It's run by Bengalis who are from this region. So people are being displaced from the Sundarbans, from other parts of southern Bengal at an enormous rate. Mm-hmm. If you go down the west coast, you'll see that everywhere the working class is actually more and more from the east. They're from Jharkhand, they're from Bihar, but overwhelmingly from Bengal. There are schools in Bangalore where now there are more Bengali-speaking students than Kannada-speaking students. There's been a massive exodus. There's been a huge demographic reshaping of the country, in effect. And that's largely due to climate change. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of fisher folk who are being displaced in Tamil Nadu because they can no longer get fish. Because, in the Bay of Bengal, apart from all the other problems, we have this terrible problem of dead zones. These are anoxic waters where no fish can survive. So we are facing a catastrophe on a scale really that is hard to contemplate. And yet people don't seem to pay attention.
Let me come back to the Sundarbans, an area which a region which you know well, which you've described with such a great felicity in all your book. At one point in Gun Island, your book, a character describes the Sundarbans, Professor Ghosh, as the frontier where commerce and wilderness look each other directly in the eye. That's exactly where the war between profit and nature is fought. In a sense, what you're speaking about, displacement of people, of fisher folk, this presumably in areas like Sundarbans is extremely acute now.
It's very acute. The Sundarban is a very strange kind of forest because it's not in any sense a forest that's remote, or we tend to think of forests as being far removed from population centers. The Sundarban has historically always been the frontier of Bengal, which is one of the most heavily populated parts of the world, but which has also been commercially very active. So throughout history, anyone who came to trade with Bengal had to cross the Sundarban. So the Sundarban is full of ancient relics. People are constantly digging up, artifacts from everywhere. So the Sundarban is, it's a very unusual and extraordinary kind of place. Again, the Sundarban, it's a mangrove forest, and mangrove forests can regenerate very, very quickly. So, the Sundarban has historically absorbed the terrible shock of cyclones. It's because of the Sundarban that Kolkata was relatively protected even this time. The Sundarban is an absolutely essential ecological belt for us, for Bengal. So I really dread the thought that that people will try to create development over there.
Because you write in your book, The Great Derangement, about being caught in the middle of a terrifying tornado and the agency of the forest dwellers in relation with the Sundarbans. How do you view this agency, this relationship, Professor Ghosh, between humans and nature? Those at the front line living in the Sundarbans, living in the ecologically sensitive areas, the coastline in Odisha, do you believe that they perhaps have a greater sense of recognition of the dangers that climate change poses as contrasted to the urban dwellers, whether in a Delhi, a Mumbai or a Kolkata?
Of course they do. They completely understand. People who live close to the soil, and that's the great majority of Indians, understand perfectly well, the dangers that are posed by the world around us, by our surroundings. City dwellers don't. But, the strange irony is that city dwellers are much more vulnerable than people in the countryside. And one of the things I keep saying about Mumbai is that if Mumbai were to be threatened by a cyclone, the working classes of Mumbai, the migrants, many of whom are from the Konkan coast, would be able to get away. The people who will be sitting ducks are actually the middle classes who will not evacuate, who stay on in their flats, and who will literally be devastated by a major storm. You saw what happened in Kolkata this time. Mm-hmm. If Mumbai were to be hit by a major storm, the devastation would be much, much worse. Because Kolkata is protected by almost 100 kilometers of land between itself and the coast, much of which is the Sundarban, in fact.
That's a warning to all my friends there in Mumbai who, as you rightly said, are also very complacent. And I've seen the complacency at times when it comes to climate change. But who takes the lead? Is it civil society? Or is it the state? We've seen, for example, displaced, marginalized communities, whether it's with the Sardar Sarovar Dam or whether it's those fighting land grabs in Odisha who've taken the lead. But should the state be much more conscious of the dangers of climate change, or should it be left to communities and civil society to, in a way, fight for their rights?
Look, the first and most important thing that must happen, and in fact, it's only municipal planners who can do it, is that they must create a preparedness, especially in Mumbai. One of the good things that's come out of my writing The Great Derangement is that a number of scientists have started working actually on cyclone preparedness for Mumbai. And what they've discovered is that, in fact, there is no preparedness for a major catastrophe like a cyclone in Mumbai. So, the very least that must happen is that they must create some kind of evacuation plan, for Mumbai and its hinterlands. Because, as I said again, the task of evacuating, let's say, 15 million people is horrendous. It literally could not be done. And so you would see scenes that are exponentially worse than what you're seeing today in Kolkata. God forbid that such a thing should happen, but you have to be prepared because more and more cyclones will come our way. The Arabian Sea, as I said, is going to generate more and more cyclonic activity. This is a well-known impact of climate change.
Of course, all of this is happening in Corona times, Mr. Ghosh. So in a way, the focus on the pandemic sometimes takes away from these other issues, but maybe they're all linked, as you said, migration, displacement, and climate change, and what's happened in Bengal. There are links which need to be sort of explored further.
Absolutely. All of these things are linked. They're not caused by each other, but they're cognate. They're all aspects of this incredible acceleration that we've seen in these last 30 years, acceleration in production, in consumption, the creation of this new liberal economy. And the coronavirus has really laid bare all the weaknesses that this has created in society. Our Indian response to the pandemic has been literally to declare a sort of class war on migrant workers. In the same way, here in the United States, now we see, really the social fabric has been strained to the point where there are now, there's looting in Minneapolis, there's the possibility of large-scale violence. It's laid bare all kinds of racial tensions and so on. So these last 30 years of neoliberal capitalism have really weakened the social fabric across the world, especially in countries that have, unthinkingly adopted these neoliberal capitalist policies, as has happened, especially over the last 10, 15 years in India.
So you actually see, whether it's in the United States or in India, the corona pandemic actually widening the social divides, the fault lines that have existed will only widen and deepen further.
Rather than widen, I would say that it's laid bare the vulnerabilities that already exist in societies. Which are the countries that have actually responded best, to the coronavirus epidemic? The country that has actually performed the best is Vietnam. Then, of course, we have South Korea and several other countries. But it's really remarkable that it's Vietnam that has performed best. Which are the countries that perform best from, let's say, disasters like cyclones? Mauritius is incredibly well prepared. I don't think they've had a fatality from cyclones there for a long time, even though Mauritius is in one of the most cyclone-prone regions of the world. Mauritius, Cuba, Hurricane Maria, which hit Puerto Rico as well as Cuba in 2017, created absolute devastation in Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico still hasn't recovered. Whereas it hit Cuba, and Cuba was so well prepared that, in fact, it created very little damage. So, these things are not, they depend, our responses depend really on the nature of governance, on the nature of the social fabric, on all these other things. And the COVID pandemic has laid bare all these vulnerabilities across the world. The countries that have performed worst, really, are the UK, the United States. It's kind of horrifying to see, the way that this is playing out.
So whether it's the climate change challenge or the corona challenge, what you're saying is that local communities that are much more integrated and led by governments that are more far-sighted and do not sort of widen the social cleavages are much better placed to counter the climate change challenge or indeed a pandemic challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, we've seen this in India. Look at Kerala. Kerala's been absolutely exemplary in the way that they've responded to the pandemic. I mean, they've set an example to the world. They've shown what can happen even in a sort of low-income country. What can be done by people who are prepared. And Kerala, again, has very high levels of education. It has all these wonderful social indicators. So Kerala has done it exceptionally well. But Odisha doesn't have all those amazing indicators. But again, they've shown us what a government that is prepared, that is looking ahead, what it can do. Yes, absolutely. It depends on the nature of governance. It depends on how people respond. And again, Bangladesh is again setting an example. Bangladesh is a country where everybody now is informed about climate change. It's a country that has done a great deal to create awareness, to create preparedness for people. India really needs to learn from Bangladesh and also from Kerala, Odisha in confronting these disasters.
Let me ask you in conclusion, Professor Ghosh, as a good Kolkatan, or should I say a proud Bengali Indian, if I may call you that, but a son of the soil. One of the defining images of this cyclone and its impact on Kolkata was College Street and books being strewn all over the place, shops destroyed, a city which sort of values learning and values books, finding bookshops destroyed. Do you hope that Kolkata will be back on its feet? And what were your first reaction when you heard of that or saw those images as a formidable writer yourself?
Well, the Boipara, that is the book neighborhood of Kolkata, has been so important to me. Since I was in my teens. I spent so much time there amongst the bookshops. In those days, we didn't really have bookshops like we have now, so we would have to look for books there. It was absolutely essential to my coming of age. I love that area. I've spent hours and hours there. So it's really devastating to see it in this state. But I should say that, many people, the Kolkata Literary Meet, for example, has put together a lot of money. They've collected a lot of money to help Boipara. So, people are responding in their ways. And, I hope Kolkata gets back on its feet pretty fast. I must say again that things could have been much worse in Kolkata. I mean, I've been on the phone with my family all the time. They did lose power for a little bit, but it was only for 8 to 10 hours. But other than that, really, I would say that it's not been as bad as, for example, Hurricane Sandy was in New York or Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico.
In fact, there's a warning in that it could get much worse. That therefore we've got to guard against complacency and recognize that climate change is now part of our lives. Amitav Ghosh, you've in a sense mainstreamed that idea through your writings, and therefore it's a pleasure to have you on the show. And let's hope that Kolkata is back on its feet and you can be back home sooner rather than later. Enjoy your isolation in a way. Very quickly, I just have 30 seconds. How are you spending your time? Are you writing? Are your creative energies bursting in Corona times?
Yes, I've almost written a whole book in these months. But thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to speak with you as always.
Thank you. Are you going to tell us what you've written on?
It's on the planetary crisis, on the pandemic, climate change, social breakdown, all those things.
Okay, great. Look forward to reading that, Professor Ghosh, and it's been a pleasure talking to you a week after Cyclone Amphan. Amitav Ghosh, the aftermath of a cyclone. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.
Hello everyone, this is Rahul Kamal here. Hope you enjoyed this video. For the latest news and analysis, like and subscribe the India Today YouTube channel and don't forget to press the bell icon to stay updated.